Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our post-2020 series. We are very excited to have you join us this morning, and today we're going to be looking at ICLEI submission to the SCBD Global Biodiversity Framework discussion document and the reflections thereon in light of the SCBD regional consultations that are in the process and that are being undertaken. So perhaps before we start, I can just say that the webinar is going to be recorded, and the recordings will be made available on the ICLEI YouTube channel, as well as the Cities with Nature YouTube channel, and will be sent to all participants who've registered. The aim of today is to start or spark a discussion. So what we are proposing is that we will run through the presentations and then provide a time and space for questions and discussion thereafter. So there will be two ways in which you can ask a question. The first is by raising your hand, and the second one is by entering in the chat box to your right. But we please ask that we go through the presentation and then we open the floor to questions. So a very warm welcome to everyone. It's great to have you all here. And the very first presentation was created by Mr. Oliver Hillel from this SCBD, and it provides a broad overview of the consultations toward the post-2020 biodiversity framework and the real issues of relevance for local and subnational governments. In his absence this morning, this presentation will be run or presented by Kobe Brandt, who's the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa, as well as the Cities Biodiversity Center. So without further ado, I will hand over to Kobe.
Thank you very much. And a warm welcome to everybody. We know it's an early morning for many of us, but for some of us it's also quite late in the day already. So thank you very much for joining us wherever you are in the world. So we're going to go through the presentation quite quickly, as Tim said. And firstly, let me just say thank you very much to Mr. Oliver Hillel for supporting the process so much from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's very important for us to note that we are, ICLEI has been asked, really approached and tasked with, willingly, shall I say, tasked with collecting the voice of all levels of subnational governments, feeding into different key milestones in the discussions towards a post-2020 biodiversity framework by the CBD, and this was decided in Egypt at the last COP, which you see the logo of there up on your screen. So in terms of the process to date is that we're doing this very much as an open consultative process, trying to be as inclusive as possible and allowing voices from as many organizations and individuals even in the subnational and local government space, and those who work with us. So parties, international organizations, science, the entire community. Our entire community of practice is very welcome to participate and enrich our discussions over the months ahead, and also when we come to key points where we will be presenting zero drafts and be informed also by other processes. So thank you for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity for affording this opportunity for our sector, and we are looking forward to doing this very much in partnership with many other organizations. These regular webinars will be one of the ways in which we get input from everybody. So Oliver has put down a slide just to say that it is still early days. It is quite clear that the, I'm just going to take that away for us. It is quite clear that it is at this stage, people are talking about the vision of for 2050, and that vision, we must not lose track of that vision, which is around living in harmony with nature. In other words, living within planetary boundaries and thriving living within those boundaries as well. At the top of his slides, he's talking about the consultations that have taken place from the CBD side. The CBD is running a number of regional consultations. There's been the Asia Pacific consultation, the European consultation, Africa, and there'll also be others. He's mentioning that this month there'll be the Latin American Caribbean consultation taking place in May, and Italy will be represented there. I know that Italy was able to be represented by Mr. Holger Rohrbrecht, who is on this call with us at the West European consultations. And in a little while, I will ask Mr. Rohrbrecht if he's willing and able to just give us a few insights into what he experienced attending that on our collective behalf. And then there are going to be 2 sets of contributions plus the GBO5. And the first very key meeting that we must all note is the open-ended working group meeting at the end of August in Nairobi. We will be there, and it's at that moment, ahead of that moment actually, that we will have to have what we call a 0 draft or a first draft of our collective position statement. So after this consultation, we will be starting to work on this draft. And I think it was very timely last week that all these wonderful documents came out, the one after the other, 3 very significant documents, which can certainly also raise the ambition globally, raise the urgency of the issues globally, and give us a clear indication of where global science is telling us to go, and also where global commitments are going. It looks very ambitious, and it certainly has inspired us greatly to be rather bold and to think rather innovatively towards formulating the subnational decisions. So early days, but it's clear that the SCBD, the collective of parties of the convention, are clear that they want to align with other processes. Specifically, they mention the climate process a lot, but also the Sendai, also be informed by the IPBES outcomes, etc., and very much the SDGs as well. And they're talking about smart engagement. In other words, they're talking about measurable and verifiable indicators, etc. And that's coming out quite strongly. They want to see really pledges and reviews and a ratchet mechanism in place for 5-year milestones. And but they're also keeping open to hear what others are saying, and things that are coming out is about no net loss of biodiversity, etc. And we see that the IPBES-7 report indicated now a loss of up to 1 million species in the decades ahead. So that's not a mean that's not going to be an easy task at all to achieve. And then their mainstreaming, of course, you know, the last 2 COPs have all been about mainstreaming into different sectors. This mainstreaming approach will continue as we move along. So I think it is very clear that mainstreaming into the sectors will form part of their parcel and thinking. That gives us ideas, but of course that doesn't mean that we have to have the same approach, but it's good to understand where the Secretariat's thinking is at the moment. In terms of subnational governments, I must say they've been very supportive, and they're also pointing out here, as we do, that the plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities for biodiversity, we are still in that decade. It's 2011 to 2020. That was adopted in Aichi in Nagoya by the parties. and the parties there encouraged really and recognized really for the first time at that scale the role of subnational governments at all levels in achieving the NBSAP goals or in supporting the achievement of the NBSAP goals, and that we have to and we can and we are developing our own tools, strategies, action plans, etc. in support of these NBSAPs. So more actionable elements came through in later years. Specifically, I want to point you to the Quintana Roo and the Sharm el-Sheikh communiques that came out in the last 3 years. And these are both statements that were made by our constituency, calling on parties to do certain things, but also committing and undertaking to collectively work with one another and our sectors in doing a number of things from our side. So we want to build on those early commitments, and we want to strengthen those. And one of the most important commitments, I think, that came out of that was actually a collective call to the parties to just implement all the decisions that they have made subsequently in the consecutive COPs. Since early days, since Bonn, when they first started talking about the role of local governments. And if parties can collectively do that already, that will go a very, very long way. So it's cross-dimensional, it looks at all the different sectors, etc., as we said, and the CBD wants to see us coming forward with ideas and statements of what they should be adopting for the post-2020 ambition in all those different sectors. Multi-level governance and cooperative structures, vertical and horizontal mainstreaming, and the city-region approach is also very, very important and coming through, and we agree with that. So I've spoken about our growing partnership. It includes also the goals, and the European Committee of Regions and many other role players are part and parcel of this process. There will also be a focus, as the CBD is indicating here, on using the new cities with nature. And in brackets, the CBD has licensed themselves to put in their cities and regions with nature. Of course, we are talking, when we talk about cities with nature, we are talking about an inclusive approach, which is open also to all levels of subnational government, who are all welcome to be active and part of that collective platform. But that platform is essentially, Cities with Nature will be the platform through which we will drive and develop the post-2020 framework. And then the evidence is clear. We've all seen the reports last week. I think it's also important just to remind ourselves that some scientists here from within ICLEI and scientists from elsewhere in the world came together and brought out last year at the COP the NUCA report, or Nature in the Urban Century report, which addressed research opportunities and gaps and was a good foundation on which, scientifically, on which we were able to build. And that was, of course, before the IPBES-7 came out, but the IPBES-7 really just strengthened what was said there already. We know the importance of the urban areas, and we know that the habitat loss that is taking place in the urban areas is very, very serious, and we can do a lot within our cities to achieve that. So, Oliver Hillel, I hope I did try to do some justice to your slides. Thank you very much for sending them through to us. And Oliver may join us for the later call today, although he is in meetings on cities in nature with colleagues of ours in Washington, with a meeting with the World Bank today, so he'll try and join us. So I'm quickly going to go through our slides, not going to focus too much on who we are, because you already know this. And you already know that we have been active collectively in this space since very early days. It's been more than 12 years now that we've been working very closely with the CBD COP processes, feeding our voices into these decisions. And consecutively, we've seen stronger and stronger decisions coming through from the COPs in terms of the role that cities and all levels of subnational governments play and should be playing. So, but we've recently upscaled. We've recently intensified our advocacy work ahead of COP15, and this is very important because COP15, of course, is going to be the Paris moment for biodiversity. And we already see the evidence and the science backing that sort of very strong post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And it is very important that we, together with our partners, are looking to a formal position that can feed into timelessly into the processes ahead of that formulation of the post-2020 framework. And let me just point out that we're not aiming to have a position paper at that COP. It will be long before that COP. Already in this open-ended working group in Nairobi in August, we will have the draft outline, because that is the moment where we need to make sure where our message lands. And then our message will be refined and further shaped, but it will already be there that we need to, this year already, that we need to have a collective statement. Just to say that the Nagoya Action Plan was really groundbreaking, and it really gives us a very good base on which to work. That Decision 1022 will go down in history as the moment when first and collectively the CBD parties decided to include and recognize local and subnational governments not as other actors or as NGOs or as stakeholders, but as governments in their own right, with own decision-making authority, and who need to play a very active role alongside national governments in the implementation of any global deal that is made. And it is here on the ground where mainstreaming and integration, as we know, is most essential, and where such mainstreaming is a daily prerequisite for good governance and sustainable development. And the mayors and the cities on this call obviously will understand that they have to deal with these decisions on a daily basis, and they make the land use decisions between subnational and local governments, depending on the country and the legislation that's applicable in any one country. It's at that subnational level that land use management decisions are made. I'm going to skip through the Nagoya Action Plan, more information about that, because I want to get to more of a discussion between us about what we want to see in this first document that we are preparing now for the open-ended working group. We will be advocating for a stronger recognition of the mandates and competencies of local and subnational government. Specifically, if we look at continents like Africa and in many parts of the global south, the mandates and the competencies are not yet clear, and there are still blurred lines in terms of where the mandates lie. And many of these mandates are still quite centralized, and we believe that it is good to advocate for a decentralization of these mandates, along with the needed finances and capacities to actually implement these mandates, and to truly work towards a multi-level way of cooperation and governance between the different levels of government. And that is the only way that we can address nature-based solutions, make them as most effective as possible. And in fact, we are saying the same thing in the climate space as well. So in the same way that we need all actors taking hands in the climate space, the same level and the same urgency is needed, and the same partnering approach is needed when it comes to addressing nature's issues that we're facing today. So this is one of the key milestones, key messages that we want to land, because although many parts of the world already have quite clarified mandates for local and subnational governments, it's not the case in all instances. And then the second issue that we want to highlight is, of course, the ecosystem approach. And that means that we do not only look at the territory and the cadastral boundaries of any one particular local government. Very often, and in most cases, in fact, local governments, the cadastral boundaries actually mean nothing in terms of where the ecosystem services and resources come from that serve that particular local government. If I look, for instance, at my city, Cape Town, a lot of the resources, water, clean air, all those aspects, the rich biodiversity, food, etc. It comes from our surrounding communities, surrounding the city. And this is the case in many big cities. Mexico City, its watershed is outside of the city, etc. We know all these examples. So we need to work on a landscape-based and ecosystem approach and strengthen our urban-rural linkages. It's no use that we build very strong, powerful cities if they do not have the resources and the ecosystems that are strong and have the integrity to keep on supporting our growing urban populations. And it works both ways, because cities, again, offer huge markets, it offer huge opportunities, etc., for these more rural communities to, specifically in food, for instance, to bolster biodiversity friendly and eco-friendly approaches when it comes, for instance, to farming practices, etc. So small scale job creation and that sort of thing in the surrounding communities is also vital for our bigger cities. That for us is absolutely a principle. We agree with FAO's approach and take on that. Another message that we want to get through, and all these messages have been maturing over the last years. We want to put them there very concretely and then build on them further, is to ensure that the past decisions are actually implemented, and I've spoken to that already. And one of these duties of implementation, of course, rests on our own shoulders. We need to take the opportunities presented by the CBD COP decisions about their recognition of local and subnational governments and turn that into concrete actions, programs, opportunities, platforms, etc. And here I want to point to the Cities with Nature platform specifically, which is a very, very large big tent platform open to any city of any size and shape and all our partners to come together, to learn from each other, inspire each other, and to commit to certain targets, and to actually then also report on their progress along such targets. And that's very much in line with the 2020 vision and what we see, what the IPB 7 is calling for at the moment, and also the leaders document, which was signed also last week, the document which a group of the G7, but with a group of other political leaders also signed, the NETS document. That also called very much for this sort of approach. So if we move forward, how can local and subnational governments be more effective in this vertical alignment? Again, looking inward, what can we do as a sector? And I want to point you to a very important document, which is a guideline document that we've collectively worked on, and many of you have actually made inputs. There are many examples of cities and subnational governments around the world of how we can contribute to the NBSAP approach, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan approach. Up until now, and up until 2020, the NBSAP is the way in which any one of the parties actually report their ambitions and their progress towards the Aichi targets. And we know the Aichi targets were also formulated and adopted in Nagoya up till 2020, and well, half of the Aichi targets do not have the 2020 deadline, but I think just more than half of them actually do end in 2020. So the world will be looking at what comes after the Aichi targets for sure, and if the NBSAP approach is still the right approach. But what we are saying here, and clear early indications are that an approach like the NBSAP approach will definitely be part of a post-2020 agreement. What we are saying here in these guidelines is that both parties, both the national governments and the subnational governments, can come a lot closer in terms of formulating these NBSAPs, sitting around a table deciding collectively what the nation's ambitions can be, incorporating the contributions that the local governments can make. And here we will be building on that vertical integration very much. So there was the paper, the discussion paper that was brought out by the CBD, and the deadline for making comments into that post-2020 global framework discussion paper was the 15th of April, and we made a couple of comments, and that documentation will be made available to everybody participating in this webinar, and we'll also send you the ICLEI comments that we made in that paper. So specific issues that we just wanted to raise was that we really need transformative change or transformational change, if you wish, and that it is important that to do that in a multi-level approach. And we also want to make the point, we don't only want to live in harmony with nature by 2050. We need to know that we are living in the urban century, and that century is reshaping the world very rapidly. Urbanization is unstoppable, and we need to really look at how cities are going to grow, how cities are going to use resources, and there, within that space, a lot of achievements can be achieved if we work together with the parties of the CBD to actually restore and bring back nature into the plans of expansion of cities and into the rebuild and reshape of cities as they are developing and progressing. So cities with nature, I've spoken about that already. For us, that is a very, very good platform through which everybody can come together and show and demonstrate what they are doing, whether they are focusing more on invasive species or on water management or on different aspects of social dimensions and health and well-being of communities. Cities with Nature will be able to demonstrate and showcase all the initiatives that are out there, but it will allow cities also to enter through pathways, learn from each other, share, commit, and report on what they are doing in the space of connecting with nature, planning with nature, nurturing nature, and working with nature. So we support the position, of course, that is in that document about involving local and subnational governments directly in national target setting, as I said, and many of these can actually be significantly advanced if we work together with all these levels of government. I'm coming to an end. I just want to say that there's also strong support from within our sector that we've been picking up and reporting on to forge stronger and more explicit alignment and synergies between what we are doing at all levels of sustainable development. So we are already looking at systemic approaches in cities, linking biodiversity, climate change, urbanization, circular economy, all those aspects together in terms of integrated solutions for cities. So we're very delighted to see that the CBD is also promoting such an integration approach between the SDGs and the Sendai and these different other approaches. So in terms of the relationship between the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and other relevant processes, we just wanted to mention that there is increasing recognition, but the inclusion of nature-based solutions in the climate summit specifically that is taking place this year, and of course then also in the upcoming climate COP later this year, is of specific importance. For us, climate and biodiversity are sitting at the same level. They are not the same, and the one should not fall under the other. They are two parallel processes that need to develop and strengthen each other. Any progress on climate change, if done with consideration of nature, will greatly enhance our targets and our achievements on the biodiversity side and vice versa. But we should not merge these two agendas completely. However, we do welcome very much the CBD approach for working much closer within the climate field, as these are very much aligned. And then mainstreaming, we've spoken about the need for mainstreaming, and really cities and our city networks and our actors have stepped forward. We have many good examples of approaches. I know in the European context, there are Horizon 2020 projects that are doing fantastic work. And our ICLEI office in Europe is involved in a number of those. Our partners, IUCN and others, are involved in numerous others as well. Here in Africa, we, for instance, have a fantastic program called Urban Natural Assets. You'll see it in the corner there. It's called UNA Rivers for Life. It's got a rivers focus, it's got a coastal focus, it's got a social focus, etc. And it runs in quite a few sub-Saharan African countries. We've got a Global South Interact Bio project, which is funded by the German BMU through the ICI process, which works in 3 continents already. It's in South Asia, in Africa and in South America, and we're looking towards really expanding that initiative in many more countries in that region, but also in other regions. And we have a legacy, a very proud legacy of our Local Action for Biodiversity program, which brought about 50 cities together from around the world, big and small cities, who all worked collectively in a progress sort of process towards a mainstreaming biodiversity. And it is through that lab process where we first coined the phrase of LBSAPs, Local Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, to complement the NBSAPs. And that work will continue. So in terms of integrating diverse perspectives, this is really where we feel it's good that we are mentioned there, and this is almost the only place where local and subnational governments are mentioned in the discussion document. But we're making the point that actually local and subnational governments should be mentioned in many more aspects of that working document, and it should be mainstreamed throughout the document, throughout the entire framework agreement. The role of local and subnational governments should be clear, loud and clear, and ambitious. And that will only benefit any global deal that is made and celebrated in China in 2020. So thank you very much, Tim. That concludes my presentation. I'm handing over to you now to facilitate any discussion. And maybe you want to also invite 1 or 2 speakers to add a few points.
Great. Great, thank you for that, Kobe. I hope everyone has enjoyed and benefited from the presentation. And at this point, we would like to welcome any questions or points for discussion. But before we do that, perhaps we can call on Holger, if he is willing, to just give a brief sort of overview of his experience of the regional consultation he was able to attend in Europe. And I will ask my colleague Julia and the World Secretariat to help me in moderating this part of the discussion. So Holger, if we can unmute your microphone, and if you are willing to just give us a few points, that would be great.
Sure, Timothy, with pleasure. Yeah, the consultation was mentioned by Kobe in her presentation as one of, I think, 4 that are being carried out by the Secretariat for the Convention in different regions of the world. The first one was in the beginning of this year in the Asian region, taking place in Japan. And the regional consultation process, I'd say, is actually a very open process organized by the Secretariat in order to really gain from both the experiences from the last decade of the biodiversity process, so the Aichi decade, if I may say so, and then learn from that, including also ideas and perspectives from a number of partners and parties for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So it was both a review element and also a perspective element in it. The 2 chairs of this process, Mr. Francis Ogwal from Uganda and Mr. Basil van Havre from Canada, have led the process in a very open and participatory spirit, suggesting really that every voice counts and every idea counts. They were presenting themselves as listeners, most of all, and partners to the process, and they just wanted to present guidance to facilitate this very open discussion process, which in my view worked very well. The 2.5 days that we spent with more than 100 participants, mostly from parties, so representing national governments from Europe, but also from North America and also from Oceania, plus European Commission as a particular body that we have in Europe, and in addition to that, we also had a number of stakeholder groups from global environmental and nature conservation organizations like WWF or IUCN, and then representatives of what is called the major groups, including youth, women, indigenous people and local communities, and then local and subnational governments. The last group was represented by myself and Rachel Levesque from Canada, and representing here the Energy Forest D network, which is the regional network that is sort of ICLEI's pendant on the regional side, and together, as Kobe alluded upon, we lead on the local and subnational government constituency. The basis for the whole consultation was the discussion paper that Kobe addressed in her presentation, which includes 17 chapters with 26 questions. And these 26 questions refer to basically all the aspects of the future Global Biodiversity Framework, but it also includes some questions that relates to like the process towards still, and then then obviously the structure of the biodiversity framework, including its vision, its mission, its orientation, what should be like the vision by 2050, what should be a milestone and orientation by 2030. This was one very important part of the discussion process. The second very important element was the sort of themes or structural elements to be included in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Kobe mentioned the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, but then also the potentially to be used targets and indicators, the performance and monitoring, reporting, verification mechanism, mainstreaming aspects, how capacity development should be included in the GBF post-2020, and what resources would be available and how it could be accessed. There was also a quite interesting debate about the terminology and communication aspects of a future framework. For example, in how far we should talk about nature instead of biodiversity in the future framework to be more embedding and give people an immediate, also emotional adherence to the message that would come out. Also ecosystem services that has been used in the past very widely was discussed whether or not it should be turned into the notion nature's contribution to people, in the same sentiment to potentially bring people much closer to the biodiversity agenda. The whole process was actually organized in stations, and all the participants were basically walking from one topical station to another and presented their input, ideas and experiences. I will not go into too many details here, but want to just mention that the like topical centers of these stations that included resource mobilization. So the question again, what type of capacities and finances can be used? Most of the discussion here was about what is called the voluntary commitments. That was an agreement from the COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh to supplement the NBSAPs and identify additional commitments that parties can put on the table to support actually the implementation of and achievement towards the Aichi targets and close the gap actually that we will see in 2020 with their implementation. But these commitments should reach beyond 2020 and have a longer lasting effect. The second element was, as I mentioned, communications and the question how messages should be brought forward, in what way. I alluded on that one. Then there was one station that focused on the integration of diverse perspectives, and this is, I think, for local and subnational governments very, very important, because in this topical segment also the contributions of cities and regions in the biodiversity framework was discussed next to the other major groups, and the question appeared, and it was actually carried throughout the consultation in Western Europe, if cities and regions should not rather be seen as a formal part of the governance structure for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, with the effect that this group would be included structurally and systematically in the process to develop and implement and evaluate the centerpiece of the future Global Biodiversity Framework, which is to and will remain the NBSAPs. There is obviously a discussion here also what makes the local and subnational governments distinctive vis-a-vis the other major groups. In my view, the point here is obvious. Whereas we have community groups in 3 of them, the local and subnational governments are a functional element, and that makes them distinctive and puts them rather in the basket of the governance framework. The next station was about the NBSAPs, and many of the discussions that I just mentioned came back, but also there was talk about the NBSAPs themselves, which don't have a proper guidance. There is no standard for the NBSAPs. Every country basically develops their own structure and also basically the contents and some of the mechanism around it. This should be taken forward, and a future global biodiversity framework should present a more standardized approach with a template potentially and more opportunities to compare and find also guidance and inspiration in other NBSAPs that are of the same kind. There is quite a number of discussion about the mandatory and voluntary commitment, how they relate to each other, what actually a voluntary commitment can mean and be in addition to what is inside the NBSAPs, and also much of the discussion is around whether or not we should have locally determined contribution, like we know from the UNFCCC, the climate process, in complementation to the national contributions, which is the NBSAPs. And Kobe mentioned also the LBSAPs, the local biodiversity and action plans, as a potential instrument for that. The final station was on mainstreaming. I think this has been very much elaborated by Kobe, and there is no additional point to make here from the consultation. The big point is that mainstreaming will be a very, very important element in the future global biodiversity framework. In addition to these 6 stations, the consultation allowed for a number of on-spot topics to be taken forward in the discussion, and the most important was actually monitoring, reporting, and verification. And I confirm here what Kobe said before, that this element of accountability, monitoring, reporting, verification will become very, very strong in the future framework. A number of aspects to the discussion have been brought forward, both very strong ideas that potentially can be implemented easily, but others that also will need more consideration, perhaps even more scientific support, as the monitoring and verification elements not easily compared to the UNFCCC. Here we have the global target to achieve or to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees, whereas in biodiversity we have numerous indicators potentially to support by a monitoring framework, and monitoring is not easy, as we know from the IPBES and previous works from scientists in regard of the identification of loss of biodiversity. So there is a number of methodological aspects still to be clarified, but most importantly, there is a great agreement at least in this Western European consultation about the ratchet moments, so that this ratchet mechanism, Kobe mentioned that in her presentation, that we need to ensure whatever we do that we walk forward towards the global ambitions and targets and never fall back. And I believe that the consultation has already presented some very interesting elements of that type of mechanism in order to meaningfully implement it. I think here I should stop. I have spoken already a little bit too long, I believe. Timothy, back to you.
Thanks so much, Holger. It's some interesting insights coming out of there, and it seems like most of them are, pretty much aligned with what ourselves and our constituency and our partners are all advocating for. So thank you for that. Thanks for your inputs. At this time, we just want to check if there's any other questions or points for discussion from anyone on the call.
It doesn't look like there are any questions so far.
All right, so if you don't mind, I have a question for Holger. Holger, having attended the European consultation process and having seen the 3 very important documents that came out last week, what do you think would have changed, if anything, in those discussions had these documents been released before your consultation? In other words, how did last week influence the discourse in your mind, and how should it influence the discourse in your mind for us?
Well, that is a very interesting question, Kobe. Thank you for that. I think we easily could spend a day or two to speculate about how the world would change if people use things at a certain point in time. But let me put it that way. There are a number of elements in these documents that could have been and were anticipated by many participants to the consultation meeting. In that sense, most of the discussion have tried to be implemented in the spirit that we need to step up our ambition level. However, I believe that the drastic messages and clarity that is now on the table, with clear messages also to policymakers, would still have changed the discussions in that way that the core aspect, the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, would have seen differently. In the consultations, many of the parties, many of the countries and national governments have actually referred to the fact that the NBSAP development was a very, very heavy exercise, and in some cases it took 7-8 years actually from the starting point in 2010 to elaborate the action plans, and the implementation has not even started in most of the cases. And many of the countries said, okay, we have achieved the establishment and publication and adoption of the NBSAPs, and we should continue using them in that same way. So I believe that many of these are quite heavy mechanisms with a diversity of very scientifically based ambitions and targets included. And also they have not obviously included the necessity of a very strong performance orientation. And I believe that exactly that would have been very much influenced. So the position of parties, of countries vis-a-vis the use and potentially progression of the NBSAPs that would have been, in my view, influenced towards let's make a lighter version, let's make a more comparable version, let's make even a standard for the NBSAPs that drives the performance forward, and that also allows really the integration of all the relevant actors, including local and subnational government constituency.
Thank you very much, Holger. And I just want to, for the record, also state to others on the call that the 3 documents I'm referring to are, of course, the IPBES 7th report that came out, and which highlighted a number of, which was the biggest effort of the IPBES community so far in terms of coming up with a collective statement on the state of nature in the world. And of course, that was released with great anticipation by the community. But as you say, a lot of people were aware, more or less, of what was going to come out of there. I think they did a very good job in really articulating the messages very well. And it was very important for us to see that there is wide recognition and encouragement also for the role of cities and other levels of subnational government from the scientific community. The scientific community clearly sees that cities, our levels of government, will need to play a very, very strong role, and our urban communities will need to play a very, very strong role in addressing the situation of the decline of nature in future. So that's very key for us, and it really boosts and bolsters, I think, the ambitions we can have and the projects and programs and initiatives our cities should be embarking on. So we from ICLEI will be calling throughout the month of May very strongly towards all levels of subnational governments, all cities around the world, to join us, take hands in our global cities with nature ambition, where we are talking about MRV type of commitments, MRV type of actions, etc. So the science community gave us a very strong confirmation of what we know the role of cities should be in the future. The second document that came out just the day thereafter is from the OECD, and that is a finance and economic business case for biodiversity action. So this was prepared by the OECD for the French presidency and the G7 environmental ministers meeting, which took place on the 5th and the 6th of May in France. The latter meeting took place, the environmental ministers meeting took place in Metz, which is in France. And which brings me to the third very important report, and that is the Metz, I think it's commitment. I don't have the document in front of me, charter or something like that, but it is very important that all the G7 countries, through their ministers of environment, as well as the EU and a number of supporting countries, from the global south, I remember Fiji and a number of others too, from Africa also, pledged their support to the Metz commitment, which again also spoke very clearly about the need and the commitment from their side to work with all levels of subnational governments, including local and others, and also giving us a strong commitment from these very important countries that they already recognize and they already are reaching out to their levels of subnational government to take action. So I think all three, these very important documents that came out, along with a letter of 400 influential people. I think there were some film stars, etc. as well, but there were certainly also some very heavyweight scientists and other leaders that pledged their names behind the letter to the G7 governments and to other governments of the world in terms of nature. That letter is also an indication of a world basically recognizing that nature needs to be at least on par with climate when it comes to commitments and action and mobilization. So from what happened last week, we feel energized. We feel it's sort of not that what we've been saying and doing is right and good, but it should be upscaled, and it should be outscaled in a very transformative and an urgent way. And in that regard, I also just want to inform participants here that the World Bank is hosting a summit this very week, and some of our colleagues are there, on the role of cities, and we are welcoming the World Bank to come on board some of the initiatives and build on what we've been building up over the last decade through their cities program. Joining Cities with Nature would be fantastic. There's the IUCN Urban Alliance, which is really taking off and focusing on indicators, which is going to be so much needed in our space in future. So we wish everybody in the sector very well in all their endeavors. We hope to see many more examples and innovative practices and so on coming through as we're leading up to 2020. And specifically also, we will be working with our colleagues in China. We've got an office in Beijing and many partners there, and the different levels of government in China, where 2020 is actually going to culminate. We are already in close contact with them to understand their ambition and their contribution, because that is also significant at a global scale. So thank you very much. I want to say we are energized. I hope our entire sector is energized with us and will join us in future webinars. And Tim, just to reiterate from our side as well, any comments, any inputs that anybody wants to make into the draft of this document that we will be preparing for the open-ended working group meeting in Nairobi in August are most welcome. Please send through your comments to Timothy, to anybody at the within ICLEI, to Holger, to any of our officers. It will reach us. You can send to me directly as well. Use any of our means of communication and get your voices heard. We'd like to share your ambition with the rest of the world. So thank you, Timothy.
Great, thank you, Kobe. And those three documents that Kobe has mentioned, we will certainly send links to them in the follow-up emails for those who have registered and participated in the webinar. So I just want to take this opportunity as well to reiterate what Kobe's already said, to thank everybody for attending, and we hope that you will join us in our next webinar as we continue on this exciting process. As Kobe said, we're very energized on our end, and we look forward to what is coming. So thank you to everyone for attending, and we will see you next time.